Good evening and welcome. Hello. First of all, apologies for the dark. So I've just learned that back in November, they rewired the place because nobody needed lights upstairs, did they? So I will have words with the manager about next time, but just think of it as a sort of friendly sort of atmosphere. Those of you who are watching on Zoom, it's quite dark in here. Good evening and welcome. My name is Mark Lainsmith. I'm the co-host of Café Théologique. Driving the Zoom version of this is Susie Templeton, who's from St John's Woodley. I work at the University of Reading, and if you're watching this on YouTube as a recording, hello, why didn't you come and see us live? It's lovely that you've come here. It's a fantastic turnout, I can just see in the dim dark. Café Théologique, if this is your first visit, happens twice a term. It's run by the University of Reading Chaplaincy and co-hosted with the Office of the Bishop of Reading. And our mission statement is really to bring theology, or people thinking about theology, into the public domain to share their ideas. So it's really a public forum. And we really do encourage you when it comes to Q&A to give your thoughts and reflections back. I mean, do it nicely, because we're Anglican, but do share what you think and your questions. So this will be recorded tonight. So if you've got a friend who couldn't come, direct them to YouTube. If you're not on our mailing list and you'd like to know what's happening and when these things go online, have a word with me or with Ace, who's just sat to my left here, who's waving. So do have a word with us afterwards. So without further ado, tonight we welcome Mother and Son combination 2 for the price of 1, Claire and Micah Hayns. Together, they have written and illustrated this book, Unveiled, Women of the Old Testament and the Choices They Made. It's a book that narrates and illustrates the stories of 40 Old Testament women. Clare Hayns, just to my right, 2 over, is college chaplain and welfare coordinator at Christ Church College, Oxford. She grew up in rural Buckinghamshire, and before ordination, she was a social worker in London, working with people with addictions and with young homeless folk. She's also run an entertainment agency with her husband, John. Her eldest son, Micah, immediately to my right, is a contemporary classical painter based in Oxford, a former student of the Florence Academy of Art in Italy, who takes his inspiration from classical painting, the Impressionists, and street art. His work is currently on show in the Jungle Art Gallery in Oxford. So if you like what you hear and you want to see some, go ask him about the exhibition. So I'm going to invite them to talk, and they're going to do a bit of Q&A, and then we may have a break for a little bit later on, and then so you can think about things, and then we'll take more Q&A. We'll aim to end by 9. If you really like what you've heard, there are books on sale. I think they're going to be £12. £12. They might even get signed if you're very lucky. We can take cards here as well as cash, so do have a word with us afterwards. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Claire, and let's give her a warm round of applause.
Thank you. Well, how lovely to see you all. This is by far, Micah and I have been going on a little tour of various venues over the last year. And this is by far the coolest place we've been to. Normally we go to church women's groups. It seems to be our genre. And so this is lovely to be here. And thank you for inviting us. So the plan is I'm going to say a little bit about how the book emerged, why I think the women of the Old Testament are really inspiring, and something about some of the rebel women of the Old Testament. So I'm going to tell you 3 stories of 3, well, there are more than 3 rebel women, but 3 stories of rebel women of the Old Testament. We're going to have a little bit where you can find out how much you already know as well. So I think with this large group, you might be able to tell me quite a lot of the names of the women that we might look at. But a little bit about, oh, and hello to all those on Zoom as well. A little bit about how the book emerged. I had no intentions or idea that we would ever write a book. I would ever write a book. It emerged that I visited in 2019 a picture gallery with Micah. We were going to go and get one of his pictures framed, and went into the picture gallery, and the picture gallery owner asked me the question that any church leaders absolutely quake at. I was wearing a clerical collar like this, and he said, "You'll know the answer to this, you're a vicar." And then said that his daughter-in-law was called Miriam, and he knew Miriam was in the Old Testament, but wanted to know more about her story. And I realized at that point that I really knew very little about Miriam. I didn't grow up in church youth groups, really, and I realized that I had a kind of quite a scant Old Testament knowledge. And so as he went off to deal with another customer, I hid behind the frames and Googled Miriam from the Old Testament, so then I could go back to him with, well, you know, Moses' sister, you know, so I realized and set myself a challenge for 2020 of writing about a woman a day for Lent 2020. So I set myself a challenge. I thought at that point it would be all the women of the Bible, because I didn't think there would be that many. And then when I got to start to list out the women who have a story worth talking about in the Bible, realized there were far, far more than I had ever anticipated. And I realized when I was listing them, how many women's stories I had absolutely no idea about. And I don't think, and having done these tours and talks, I think it wasn't entirely my own ignorance. I think a lot of us have no idea about a lot of the stories of the women in the Bible. And so having done this Lent blog, and obviously in 2020, it hit a pandemic just as I started the blog. And so it sort of became something else, and people were shut down. And suddenly, as I was telling the stories each day of these women, I was then trying to relate them to what was happening in the world, and found that actually there was a lot of connections that could be made from the women's stories to our own story. And that was something that has really come through this, is how, even though these women lived thousands of years ago, the challenges and their stories, although in many ways very different to ours, in many, many ways incredibly similar and very current, and the similar themes that come through all human stories, and particularly stories for women as well. And I found that many of the women in the Old Testament and in the Bible often are the sort of bit parts of the main story. But what happened was, when you actually just focus on them and try and flesh out and imagine what it must have been like for them, it really revealed something else. And so I really believe that we should be focusing on them more. Our churches often in the lectionary, if any of you are in churches and in those churches use the lectionary, often we kind of skip over those stories. And so trying to reveal their stories a bit more seemed to be a really important thing. Partly why our book was called Unveiled, sort of somehow unveiling these stories that haven't been told, and unveiling these women that have been so far kept to the edges and in the dark. Just to pause, just to see what we already know, think about. I know that you will know some of the women in the Old Testament. I'll give you one, Eve. Okay, so there we go. There's the first. Giving you Eve. So amongst us, and if those are live on Zoom, they can put it into the chat. We can see how near I didn't include all of them, so you will come up with some that we don't have. But you're going to have to shout loudly so that we can be heard. And Mark might count and see how far we get. Okay. Rachel. Susanna. Excellent story, Susanna. In the Apocrypha, Susanna. So yes, do read it. Rachel, Leah, Deborah, Susanna, Ruth, Bathsheba, Miriam. I gave you Miriam. Esther, Tamar, Naomi, Hagar, Rahab. This is the Rahab is the front of, that's Rahab on the front of the book.
Ruth.
Sorry?
Ruth.
Rebecca, yeah. Hannah. Jezebel. Jezebel gets a bad press. Jezebel has a dictionary definition for being a sort of wanton woman, which is really unfair for Jezebel. She did murder quite a lot of people. However, she put some makeup on as she went to her death. And so for that, she is labeled this kind of wanton woman, but actually she was married and helped out her husband by, you know, being a bit mean and killing lots of people. But I do think she has an unfair press.
We've got some.
Judith, another, you like the Apocrypha, you go for the Apocryphal.
We've got some from Zoom.
On Zoom?
I've lost a track a bit of
Yeah.
who we've already had, but we've got Dinah.
Dinah, we haven't had Dinah.
Mrs. Noah.
Oh, Mrs. Noah is good. Mrs. Noah is not in our books, but that's great.
Lot's wife as well.
Lot's wife, yeah.
Tamar.
We had Tamar.
Shipra, Pua, and Jochebed.
That's brilliant, because we're going to talk about Shipra and Pua. And Jochebed, do you know who Jochebed is? Jochebed's Moses' mother, yeah.
Huldah.
Huldah, I'll show you a wonderful picture of Huldah. Why, Delilah?
Yeah.
I think we had Esther, didn't we? Yeah. Who was just before Esther? Yes, Vashti. Now, Vashti as a rebel woman, I'm not going to talk too much about, but Vashti was an amazing example of a woman who refused, who said no to a man. King Xerxes wanted to parade Vashti in front of all his drunken guests, and she refused to go, Queen Vashti, and for that she was deposed and made the way for Esther. But a really courageous thing to do.
We have
Jael with her tent peg,
yeah,
through Sisera's temple. Bathsheba. I think we've done well. Zipporah, Abigail. We're going to talk about Abigail, so thank you. Okay, so let's show you all the different.
28.
28. I think that's very good. There we go. These are the women that we have in the book. There were a few more that got left out, but Sarah, I don't think we had Sarah. Abraham and Sarah. Yeah, so Hagar, Lot's wife, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, Dinah, Tamar. We had all of these, didn't we? Potiphar's wife. Do you remember? Poor Joseph, seduced by Potiphar's wife and then flung into prison. Shipra and Pua, who I will tell you about shortly. Jochebed, Miriam. Now the daughters of Zelophehad, I will tell you about shortly. And I'm very glad you didn't get them, because then I can tell you about them. Rahab, we had Naomi, Ruth. Did we have Deborah? Yeah. Jael. Now the first Mrs. Sampson. Everyone knows about Delilah, but the first Mrs. Sampson is really worth reading about. She had probably the worst wedding that's ever known, and poor first Mrs. Sampson. Sampson was not the greatest of husbands, I think, and basically at the wedding, because of this riddle, created a complete battle between him and all the wedding guests, and it ended up with him putting fire on 400 foxes and setting it off into his enemies' fields. and everyone being killed. When you look into stories in that period of history, you have to have a strong stomach, I think, a lot of the time. Delilah, Jephthah's daughter, another sad tale. Bathsheba, Hannah, Michal, the only woman in the Bible where she is said to have loved someone. She loved David, and a story of a woman who loved David, but by the end of their marriage, she despised him with all her heart. He was looking at King David. I mean, he was incredible, and the Psalms and all that we have from David, but through the eyes of the women in his life, not quite so great. Would you agree? Yeah. He was a rotter. I think he was a rotter too, yeah. So, and poor Michal realized that. Yes, he was from a dysfunctional family, we'll give him that. Abigail, the medium, the witch of Endor, interesting tale with Saul at the time of Saul. Rizpah, she stood by, her sons were killed, and she stood by the side and were with them. An amazing story, actually, and a kind of story that is really reminiscent of the women who are watching and waiting with Jesus at the cross, actually. Rizpah. The best name in the whole Bible, Abishag the Shunammite. The great name. And Abishag the Shunammite had probably the oddest job in the whole Bible. Her job was when King David was an elderly man and he couldn't keep himself warm, and they sent out for a young woman to lie by him to keep him warm at night. So that was her job. But it was an amazing story because Abishag was there when the kingship passed from David on, and she was in the corner watching. So it reminds you of all these women who were not powerful but were present, watching history happen. The maids, the people who were in the background, and Abishag the Shunammite was very much in that background. The Queen of Sheba, wonderful, who traveled for wisdom. Jezebel, widow of Zarephath. Susanna, the Shunammite woman. Naaman's maidservant. Atalia, she was the only woman in the whole of our book that I could think of nothing nice to say about her. I tried with all of them, but Atalia was pretty brutal and murdered even her grandchildren. But she also came from a pretty dysfunctional family, so perhaps that was what you could say. But also reminder that, you know, women are not necessarily the gentler sex always, and women can be pretty brutal as well. So, but Atalia, interesting. Huldah, I think, was the very first, and perhaps the very first to take text and interpret it for the people. So some remnants of text was found in the temple, and they went and said, Huldah, we don't know what it means. Huldah will interpret it. So I think she's really interesting for that. Vashti, Esther, and Shalem's daughters, who have one line in the whole of the Bible in building the wall, Nehemiah's wall. And there's a whole chapter where all these men are building the wall, and it has Shalem and his daughters, and a real reminder that, you know, all are part of this work of rebuilding then, and that even the ones with the little tiny amount of, you know, just a little subtext are still valuable and still important. Anything whilst I pause? Any questions, thoughts? I'll bring a mic, and then I'll tell you 3 stories before the Q&A. But anything you want to ask at this point? Shall I just keep going? Okay. So all of these stories have been illustrated. Well, he doesn't really like the word illustrated, but you can talk about that later. But Micah has done an image for them all, and they're really beautiful. And he's picked out something in each of the stories. But the first story is of the rebel women, which would the first women or the first people to exercise, I think, in history. What's the word? I will just find the word. I'll come to it. Anyway, these are any of you midwives? Any ex-midwife? Hey, these are the rebel midwives. They are the rebel midwives, Shiphrah and Puah. Now it's in Exodus 1, and it's at the time where the Pharaoh was beginning to think that the Israelites were becoming too numerous. At the time of Joseph, they were working together, but they were becoming too numerous, and the Pharaoh was wanting to enslave the Israelites, and there was an edict at this point where he wanted to kill the Israelite babies because he felt that he wanted them to be less powerful. So he called upon all the midwives to kill the babies at birth. Now, it's an amazing story because these women are named by name. We know Shiphrah and Puah were these midwives. And it is, I think, the first recorded act of civil disobedience, was the word that I was looking for. Anyone here could tell me if there is another act of civil disobedience that has been written and recorded. But Shiphrah and Puah have been given this edict from the Pharaoh, who wonderfully isn't named, and we have their names. So the Pharaoh gives this edict, and what they do is they rebel, but they use what they have, and they come up with a really clever, quite racially charged way in which they can get around this edict. They say to the Pharaoh, these Israelite Hebrew women, they're very vigorous and strong. So they give birth before we even arrive on the idea of not like these sort of weak Egyptian women that need, so who can argue with that? They weren't going to be in the room with these women. The Pharaoh and his soldiers weren't going to go anywhere near the women giving birth. And so the boy babies were born. And because of Shiphrah and Puah's bravery, and because of them cleverly standing up to Pharaoh, Moses was born. And as we, I'm sure, know, Moses being the great prophet who led the Israelite people into freedom. So that's Shiphrah and Puah, and Micah's lovely picture of a baby, a newborn baby. The second story of rebel women are actually 5 women. They are called Machlan, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. You've probably never heard of them, but they are the 5 daughters of Zelophehad. And it's right at the end of the book of Numbers, which someone once said actually quite recently to me that it's a really terrible name, the book of Numbers, because who wants to read a book called the book of Numbers? But actually in Hebrew, it's called In the Wilderness, which is a much better name. Why do we, I don't know any theologian, people can take on why we call it the book of Numbers, but it's In the Wilderness. So the daughters of Zelophehad were 5 women who were born to Zelophehad, who had died. So this was at the end of the time of, so the Israelites escape from Egypt. They're wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, which means lots and lots of years. And they have built up into the 12 tribes, plus the 2 additional tribes. So they've got these 14 tribes. and they're looking to go into the promised land. And so they're allotting land. And it was a classical patriarchal society. And so land would be passed down through the father to the sons. Now, Zelophehad had died and he only had daughters. So the land that was going to go to his tribe was going to go to a completely different tribe, and his name would die out with him. Now, these women decided that that wasn't good enough. So they went together to the holy tent, the tent of Moses and the religious leaders, and they argued their case. And they did that in a way that was forthright, concise, and brilliantly argued. And they said, this isn't right. Why is it that the land given to my father will die out with him? And Moses doesn't know what to do. And so he prays about it. And he goes away and prays. And he comes in his prayer, God says to him, the daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying, which is really rather wonderful. And he changes his mind and the rules change. And so from that moment on, the land is given to when they get into the promised land, and they do, and the land is then given over to these daughters. And this changes the land rights for women for the Israelite communities down the generations. And so their act of gathering together and their bravery changed the lives of people. And still today, one of the UN sustainability goals is land rights for women, because we know that if women are given the power, especially in the developed world, over the land that is to be tended, people are less likely to go hungry. And so this was a really important thing that they did. And I don't think that these women would have been heard if they'd have gone just Machlan on her own. Wouldn't have been heard, but somehow combining and joining forces and going made that change happen. And it's a reminder of the power of groups to bring about change, isn't it? And that is very relevant for us today. Just going to pause to have a little drink. And I'll carry on to the third story of the rebel women, which is Abigail, who I don't think we hear enough about. And Abigail, I think, gives the most wonderful peacemaking speech that we have in the Bible. And Abigail was at the time of David. So King Saul, David was banished and was at that time going around with a group, and they would look after farms in the community, and it was at the bottom of the mountains. Now, Abigail was married to a chap called Nabal, or Nabal, I'm not quite sure how you say it, but Nabal. Now, Nabal, his name means fool, and he was boorish, he was a drunkard, and he was a fool. And she is named in the Bible as being wise, intelligent, and beautiful. And so Nabal, when David and his men had been protecting his sheep, came to join in the celebrations at the time. And Nabal basically picks a fight with David. He pretends he doesn't know who he is, and he upsets him. And David, being a bit of a rogue, as we know, takes the slight badly, and he gathers all his men, and he is coming to fight Nabal, basically. And one of David's men goes to Abigail because he knows that she's the wise one to seek help. So Abigail does an incredible, she's very insightful. She knows the way to make peace. So what she does is bakes loads of cakes. she puts her donkey with loads of cakes of raisins, and she travels out to go and meet David. And she does all the peacemaking strategies, essentially. She gives him cakes. She throws herself at his feet. She flatters him, my lord, my lord. She basically tells him that her husband's a fool and that he shouldn't listen to him at all. And finally, she does a very insightful thing. She reminds David of who he is. She reminds him of God, that you are called by God, and do you want this foolish man on your conscience, essentially? He's not worth it, is essentially what she says. And he changes his mind. He turns around, he realizes that Abigail is absolutely right, and he goes back and takes his soldiers and goes back, and that there is no fight. She even cleverly doesn't tell Nabal what has happened until he's sober the next day, and he's so shocked by what she's done that he has a heart attack. So it was a kind of good outcome all around, except that she's then married off to David, which, as we know, is not always the best end of a story. But these women's stories, from the women whose act of disobedience means that Moses is born, these women who gather together to change land rights for generations of women, and this woman who shows how peacemaking can be done. I think they all have so much to tell us, and these are just 3 of the stories and a few that I've scattered around in the talk. But I think for me, they have a lot to tell us. We can learn a lot from them, and their stories are often not so separate from our own as well. So I'm going to pause now, and maybe you'll have some questions, and then Micah can talk a little bit, or you can ask some questions about Micah, about the process in creating images for all of them. But hopefully you have some questions.
I'll bring the mic out and around, so just if you wouldn't mind putting a hand up, that would help me find you. Any questions at the moment?
It's a very simple one, really. Do you have a favourite woman from all the women that you studied?
They go in phases, but Abigail, for many reasons, as a peacemaking woman, was quite important to me at some points. Miriam, I think there is a bit where Miriam goes into the wilderness and she's the first worship leader in the Bible, and she leads the women in singing. And there was at times in the pandemic and when things are a bit bleak, just a reminder of Miriam to be thankful for things. And so Miriam, I felt quite close to at different points as well, just as a reminder. So, but they come and go. You won't like it.
I could answer. I quite enjoyed Abigail's story. So the one Mum just mentioned, and she's called the Desert Diplomat in the book, and so I kind of used sort of deserty colours and tried to capture that. And then also Rachel, which is here. I quite enjoyed painting which ones I enjoyed making. I enjoyed sort of making Rachel. I think portraiture is my favourite, and capturing kind of the eyes, sort of trying to focus on one element of her story, which is sort of in Rachel's story, her sort of sadness of not being able to bear children. So I think that was kind of the main emotion I want to capture. And then Holder. I do have an image of Holder. It's at the end. I can go through some. This is Dinah. They're cropped slightly. So this is an example of one where you can't really see it on this, but I've painted it on the perspex. It's in 2 layers. So there's a perspex layer and then a background layer, which is sort of collage. So it's more of a kind of pop painting, more contemporary. And then this is Jezebel. Some of them are charcoal, some of them are oil on canvas. This is oil on canvas, it's a bit more traditional. Jephthah's daughter, which is a bigger painting, it's a cropped image.
I've annoyed Micah by putting all the PowerPoint into a cropped format using something else. So I'm slightly in trouble, but yes, next time I won't do that.
Yeah, this one is this one was really a really difficult painting to make because it's so simple. So it's often trying to chisel away all the information in the image or the reference I'm working from just to capture the emotion and yeah. So a lot of the time when I'm actually painting, you know, a lot of the time is taking away rather than adding, and sort of adding, taking away, and trying to capture simplicity of it. And yeah, this is quite a hopeful image, but her story is pretty depressing because she gets sacrificed right after this moment. She welcomes her father, and then he says, whoever comes out to greet me first, I will sacrifice to God or something. And yeah, so and then Holder, again it's cropped, which it is, but I tried to capture the kind of stern look of a prophetess. It was sitting in my studio for a long time, just like looking over me, which was a bit intimidating. Yeah.
When we were listing women in the Bible, you spoke about a number of women who were in the Apocrypha. And for the layperson who may not be all that familiar with the Apocrypha, what are a few good stories from the Apocrypha of women that might be good entry points to explore more?
I mean, I think that Susanna is just one chapter. Is that her whole story is in one chapter. And the story of Susanna is really interesting because it's about it's very current essentially, because it's of a woman who is having a bath in her garden, which is where they would, you shower, and she's being spied on by a group of men who then do pounce on her, and she gets away, but she shouts and they accuse her, and she's taken off to be accused, and she's not believed because she's a woman, and they believe these important men. And then Daniel, as a kind of prophet, Daniel comes and speaks up for her, and they realize that these men are lying, and and it's really quite an interesting kind of story that the fact that it's in the Bible at all is actually really interesting because it has a good outcome as well. And but it is about a woman who's not believed, essentially. So it's a really interesting. There's Judith in the Apocrypha, but I don't really know the story of Judith so well. I didn't write on her. So do you know the story of Judith?
The key point is that she lures the enemy's leader to her tent and cuts off his head.
We should have done that one.
Girl power, right. Okay, another question over here.
We really enjoyed the videos that you did with Bible Reading Fellowship. So as a group, we looked at 8 of them. And I just wondered, why did you choose the 8 that are in the series? And are you going to do any more?
Yeah, we did. We made this time last year 8 short videos with questions for Bible study groups, kind of to use together. And it was quite difficult to try and choose 8 different ones. We've put the book into sections rather than going from Genesis, along, because otherwise it doesn't really work. You just get lots of the same sort of story, get a lot of kind of relentless, the women that are wanting babies at the beginning of Genesis, essentially. So we wanted to try for the videos to pick a woman from each of the sections. So there is a kind of mum's the word, a one about motherhood. There is one about women at work. So people, different types of work. There is a hashtag them too section. So we've chosen one from each of the sections for the videos. But I'd love to do more of the videos of BRF, because I love doing it. It was fun. So we should, maybe ask them to do more.
And we've got a question on Zoom from April. She says, thank you so much for the wonderful book. Do you think the lectionary has done these amazing women a disservice? We've lost so much by not having these important perspectives of subverting the dominant power struggle, which seems to be such an important part of the gospel.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I would love them to relook at the lectionary and to change it so that we have more of their stories. I mean, with the Daughters of Zelophehad, what a fantastic story. When we were going through the morning prayer lectionary in the cathedral, it literally goes from Numbers 26 to Numbers 28, or however it is. It just misses them out. And it was so frustrating, because you think, well, actually, why are we missing them out? That I know in our churches, we often are preaching on the gospel. And so we do have to, if we are going to preach on these stories, we have to put them in. We have to shoehorn them in. People come and ask me to speak. Often I'll say, yes, I'll speak on that, but can I, you have to do a little detour to try and make, bring their stories alive again. But often people do themes, so I think we just reminding people that they're there, and giving people the confidence that actually there is something that is relevant from their stories, and that we can do that. But it's difficult, isn't it? We've had so many years of them not being spoken about.
Have you ever thought of doing a general one on widows?
Widows?
There's a lot in the Bible about widows, and I find the Bible very sympathetic towards them.
That's right. That's really interesting, because there are lots of that would be a nice theme. Yeah. I mean, there are a couple, the widow of Zarephath, whose jars keep filling, and in the New Testament. So yes, I haven't thought of it, but thank you. Thank you.
It's really good to hear some of these stories, which are sounding very positive. But I have to be honest, I've always thought that the Bible as a whole actually does oppress women. And some of those stories in the Old Testament as well as the New Testament. So my question is, do you think as a whole piece, if you can possibly look at it like that, is it more oppressive than liberative?
It's a really good question, and you can't look at these women and not come away with the reality that their lives, that many were oppressed. There is certainly a trajectory where the women who have more power, the prophetesses, the queens, are coming later on in the narrative. So there is certainly a trajectory. So the Genesis women, their main function was to produce, and but that is as it was for these very primitive societies. And I think that looking at the Bible as a whole, and when we go into the New Testament and how Jesus treated women, constantly raising women up, constantly bringing, the woman was the first person who witnessed the resurrection, and we, I think that there is hope, and that is where the narrative is going. We then kind of in our history have then oppressed women again, haven't we, and given them less voice, and we're now having to, but I think that I think it is remarkable to see how women, talking about rebel women and women who have used the power that they have, often, which is very soft power, often having to use their relationships, use their wisdom. Cunning is the word often described, but in order to get around this. But I think I do see that there is a trajectory, and then I look at how Jesus treated women, and I think that gives me hope. Did that answer that? Well, I agree. Yeah.
Micah, I was wondering, how did you go about getting an image of how these women should look in your head? Did you look at old classical paintings of these women, or are there any real women behind them? What was the inspiration?
Yeah, so I'd start off by kind of reading what Mum had written and what she'd focused on, or and sort of scriptures themselves. I would Google kind of, like, for example, Sarah or Delilah. I'd Google the kind of classical painters, how do they portray her, and it's very a sort of intuitive process. So I'd feed off of the expressions, the kind of their stance, their kind of authority, or how they were portrayed in classical art, and sort of a lot in the Renaissance and that time period. But then and I have like sort of thousands of portraits, thousands of images, and I kind of take references from different ones, and or combine two together, and yeah, I'd have a kind of a sense, a sort of sense of their character that I would then kind of try and bring out, but obviously I don't know what they look like. I mean, sometimes you get a sense of their age, or when there's their story, or the story that Mum had focused on, how old were they at that point. So I think, I mean, with Holder, I can imagine her as a sort of older lady, and some of the other ones, like Rachel, she's quite young there, but we haven't got so many variety. But then some of them are more kind of, so Miriam is a sort of dancing image of these ladies dancing, and it's very like a kind of gestural drawing, trying to capture the emotion of her worshipping, which is what Mum's focused on. So I think it's it's not always the personality, sometimes it's capturing the setting as well. And but yeah, I think I did a lot. I probably did 80 pieces of work, and then 40 of them I chose. So I think I did Sarah about 4 times, and then yeah, so I was going through a lot of process change in my own work, so I was experimenting and trying to find my voice in that. So but I threw away a lot of art to get the right, I mean, yeah, to get I do one, I'm like, oh, it's not quite her. I don't know how I know what she would be like, but
just wanted to follow that up, Micah, about did you read the text again and again, and maybe pray with the text under your personal faith? I'm wondering just if you could say a little bit about the envisaging process.
Yeah, good question. So I think my own faith is really intertwined with my art process, and when I have, in general, when I have new painting ideas, it will feel like a kind of, a real sense that I have to make it, is without sounding too kind of wishy-washy, but it's definitely a kind of, and with the book, with the pictures in the book, I'll definitely read the text, and I think I'd sort of pray in the sense that I had a real sense of God throughout the whole making of the book, and even like the fact that the book was existing, and there was moments where I mean, how do I capture Lot's wife, or JL standing somewhere with a tent peg without like you know, blood getting everywhere, and but you know, and I was doing so many at once, and even doing the 5 sisters, I had no idea how I was going to do that, and it was like on my to-do list, and you know, you come to it and you've got half a week to a week to do the painting, and I haven't got time to, you know, paint 5 sisters in this big picture, but then, you know, the image of a silhouette, you know, I could do silhouettes, and they were really effective because it's sort of coming from, you know, the back of the figure, so I didn't have to do too much detail, so it was time efficient as well. So trying to have all of those things, you know, it was definitely, you know, there was definitely a lot of answers to prayer within the process. Yeah.
Quite a broad one, and you can address it how you like, but I suppose what was the most surprising aspect of the process for you both, of writing and illustrating or drawing pictures for the book?
I think the whole thing was surprising. I really do. I think it was an absolute gift at the time. There were difficulties. There was a pandemic. My work was quite complex, and these women just got me through and got us through. And I found the whole thing a complete mystifying surprise. So, and the fact that BRF, Bible Reading Fellowship, who published the book, were just brilliant, and it just all happened really quite easily. We went, yeah, we've got this idea, and here's the book, and they went, yeah, that sounds great, and it just happened. And so it was just an absolute gift, and they did a really beautiful job, and just opening it, I had no idea of what it would look like, and then seeing this kind of nice boxy book that just looked lovely was just a huge joy. So I think the whole thing, and then doing it with Micah, I mean, what a nice thing to be able to do. And yeah, so, and we'd have all this kind of, he'd give me these images, like, I know that's not right, that's too old, Sarah, you know, too young, you know, Sarah needs to be this. And so just the whole trying to work it out together was really fun.
Just going back to does the Old Testament oppress women? I think it's not so much what the Old Testament does, it's the way it's been read and the stereotypes that have been made of women such as Eve, and rereading those stories and looking at them, the way you helped us to do, really enabled us to see these women from a different point of view. And also, I think the very fact that some of these dreadful stories where dreadful things happen to women are there is showing that the Bible doesn't cover these things up. You know, societies usually want to hide things when women have been raped, or you know, the incest that happened to Tamar and all those sort of things. But it's there in black and white, and it's often the men that don't come out very well.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And I think one of the beauties in the Old Testament is it tells life as it is. It's really gritty and raw and difficult, and some of it's funny. I mean, some of it is just ludicrous, like the first Mrs. Sampson, the story of these 400 foxes with, you know, it's like, this is ridiculous. But so some of it, you know, but a lot of it is, okay, this is people's lives are really hard. So yeah, no, I agree.
Hello, hiya. I'm just curious. It's a bit of a fun question, really, for both of you. Just wondering who you would put forward for a candidate as Prime Minister out of your women.
Nice. Oh man. Well, Deborah's great because she sat under her tree and people came to her. And so Deborah was a prophetess who sat under the tree of Deborah. And I love, you know, why did she, and they would come, and they would come with all their problems, society problems, and she would sort them out, and she would give wisdom to them. So I think she'd sit under her tree, and then everyone could come with their conflicts. You know, Harry and Meghan could come up and ask Deborah, how am I going to deal with this? And, you know, you could get, you know, they could come and ask for guidance. And Barak said, I won't go to war unless Deborah's with me. And she's like, really? Then if you win, they'll say it's only because you had me with you. And he said, yeah, I'll still want you there. So, so I love that. So I think Deborah, yes, I agree. Great question. Thank you. Oh, did you? Great.
I was just wondering, the exhibition you mentioned, are any of the paintings from the book in it or the rejected ones?
The rejected ones are all in the bin, probably. Or like half finished, or I mean, yeah, it's all a process, really. And they are they're not in my current gallery, but they're all up at Wycliffe Hall actually this time. So there's about the Theological College in Oxford. So they have starting today actually. They've got about 16 or 17 originals from the book. Some of them have been sold, so we've sold 7 or so of the originals, but the ones that are still kind of here or not sold are up there. And yeah, but yeah, the ones that I rejected, yeah, they might be somewhere in my mounds of drawings, but and there were a few because we did originally a blog. So we did a blog, and I just did some sketches for that. So I still have those. And when Mum kind of started off before the book, you know, and then I decided to do like 40 full-on proper paintings and drawings. But yeah, so I have some sketches. Deborah was one of the ones I had originally done for the blog. I think that's the only one which I kept from the blog to the book. But
Micah, what's the reception been like of your pictures? Have you had people say anything? You know?
Yeah, I think people seem to enjoy them. I hope. I spent a long time on them. So I think I got to like 30 and I was like, oh my goodness, why 40? Can we have done 20 of them? But it was, you know, I took a lot of time, and you know, some of them took, you know, I think Jephthah's daughter took probably about, you know, up to 20 hours to make this painting. This one sold. But yeah, but I did try and capture the different sizes. So that's part of the great thing of seeing them in exhibitions. You can appreciate the different scales and the different mediums I used. So like I mentioned, I used sort of more like painting on the glass, like acrylic glass with Dinah with a more contemporary background. But then this is oil on canvas, so it's more traditional. And then there's a lot of charcoal drawings, which are all different sizes. So the cover image is literally this big, tiny little painting, but then Queen Vashti, which is a drawing, is, you know, a big A1 image, and that, you know, gives a totally different effect. So
if anybody has places that they'd like to exhibit work, preferably with people who might buy art, we're always really happy to do that, because it's lovely for people to see them, because they really are lovely. So if you do, in all seriousness, have places that Micah could exhibit, that would be great.
Someone on Zoom wants to know if Rachel has been sold.
Yeah.
yes, it has, unfortunately, to my grandparents. They bought that at the opening, so we had an opening exhibition with all of them. So I think we literally had all 40. But on my yeah, so there's prints of all of them on my website, and actually, you know, it says which ones have been sold or not on my website as well, at the last slide. But yeah, so that yeah, so we did have a big exhibition of all 40 images when we first sort of launched the book, and that was where Rachel sold, and Jezebel sold as well, which was also one of my favorites.
Which slide is the? Oh,
so my website is just micahhayns.com. Yeah.
We're going to pause so you can charge your glasses and go to the loos downstairs and upstairs, along with the bulbs. They're not working up here. Those on Zoom didn't need to know that. Just a quick round of applause. So we'll give it 10 minutes break. Do talk to people about your interesting stuff about scripture and gender. You might want to have a conversation about that. You might want to talk about who is the most important woman for you in the Bible. Have you given this some thought? Why are they important? What's missing? Who would you put in scripture now? What kind of woman would be there now if it were written today? Have interesting conversations, and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes. We do have a box of books over here. They'll be on sale soon. Hold off, Chris. But if you do want to have a peek, come and have a look in this corner.